All right, good people. So we are set to my bad. Forgot forgot Zoom likes to be playing games with my name. Uh but yeah, no, we're set to continue to chat about some really interesting topics here in React. Um we've been over the last couple of weeks now, we've been kind of diving into some of the most important concepts in React. And so just kind of want to touch base on what those are real quick, and then kind of do a lightweight example of a very important concept in React that you're going to be using very frequently in different components that you're building out. And that thing is called conditional rendering, which just by its name, conditional rendering, you probably can guess what it does. But I want to kind of just give us some practical examples either way, so that folks know that it is a possible thing to do with React, and that it is something worth knowing. So first things first, I'm just going to share my screen here and walk us through a little bit of where we're at with the main kind of concepts in the React space, right? So again, the reactjs.org website is a great resource for anyone that's trying to get started in React. We've been going through a lot of the documentation and some of the core concepts of the React library. And a lot of those concepts are stored on here on the right-hand side. If you look at it on your desktop, they talk about JSX, which is essentially a markup language in JavaScript that lets you build different elements that are going to translate into visual elements on your screen. We talked a lot about the components and creating like these very reusable objects that hold JSX elements and essentially allow us to import JSX into different files and really organize our code in much more efficient ways. We talked about state and props and how we pass data between different components and within a component itself. And we talked a lot about events and like how to go about like responding to things going on from the user. So whether that was clicks, whether that was form inputs changing, whatever the event is, we've talked a lot about how we can use events in React to then essentially change our UI in unique ways. And so the next big topic that I want to talk about is conditional rendering, which is a very important topic in React because one of the valuable things that conditional rendering allows you to do is it allows you to create a UI that can change based on some condition, which might sound self-explanatory, but in practice is actually really cool, a really cool use case of what React allows you to do. So let's say, for instance, you have two components, right? You have this user greeting component that says welcome back, and you have like a guest greeting component for someone who maybe is not necessarily formally welcome, but you give them a please sign up kind of text there, right? So say, for instance, we create a greeting component in React that will display those two components, right? You can use conditionals in order to change what particular component gets rendered given a specific condition. Remember that the job of a component is to return some JSX, right? So in this functional component here, the main role of this greeting component is to return some JSX. So that's its only job, right? But you can return the JSX in a conditional if there's something very specific that's going to change what type of return you would want to have based on a specific condition. So in this case, say for instance, this greeting component receives a prop called is logged in. And so it grabs the prop from its parent and says, okay, I'm going to check to see if you're logged in. And so if you're logged in, I'm going to return the user greeting. Else, I'm going to return the guest greeting. That's a little bit in an easy sense what conditional rendering allows you to do, right? Is like render based on a condition. So here we can see in maybe what might be a separate component and maybe in our or in our like in an index.js file, if you use the create React app toolchain, you'll see like this greeting component is getting returned. Here they're passing the prop, setting it equal to false at first. So if you were looking at this particular conditional, which which greeting would be rendered at this point if the prop is false?
The guest greeting.
Definitely. Yeah, so the guest greeting would be rendered, right? Because is logged in this case is not true, so it wouldn't return this, it would return false. And so the guest greeting would be rendered. And so that is the value of that's the value of the conditional rendering, right? Is it allows you to basically say, hey, in one component, this greeting component, I might return this or I might return this. And thereby you can give your component a little bit more flexibility and use props more creatively to show how one component can kind of be responsible for showing one thing or another thing, right? And we use this conditional rendering stuff pretty often, like more often than you think. Here, clearly, they're giving us a good example of like an authentication kind of flow, or like a some type of a login scenario. But that happens pretty often, right? Like that, you might want to show one page for a user that's signed in versus another page for a user that's not signed in. And that kind of like if you wanted to, you could have multiple components, but at some point you're going to need to render something that is going to be responsible for saying, hey, are we logged in? Which component should I show if we are, if we're not? So typically you'll have one component that's kind of like the kind of like a container or like a parent component that is responsible for choosing which component to show in the case of some condition being made, right? So clearly in the docs, they give us this example of the greetings and like the whether somebody's logged in or not. But I'm sure you can already think about in your mind like other types of ways that conditionals can be used. And so here they're giving another example of like buttons, like login buttons and logout buttons. And if you think about it, right, like you might have an example in your application where you're like, oh, like I want to show to the user that's not logged in to log in, and show to the user that is logged in to log out, right? And that might require two different types of components or two different elements. But what this example here is showing is that you can actually use state as a means of basically creating a conditional operation that will allow you to set whichever component based on what the case is. And so here's an example of us using the state, right? So here they made a class-based component, and the value of the class-based component is that we can create state very easily, right? So here they created a state for is logged in. So they're still kind of going with this login kind of concept. And then in the render, we see that they're going to be checking the state to see if the user's logged in. They're going to be grabbing a button, and we'll see what they're doing here in a second. But then they do this conditional operation, right? If is logged in, then they set that button variable equal to a specific piece of JSX, whether it's the logout button custom component or the button's going to be the login button custom component that they created, right? And then their render in the return is only responsible for showing the div, right, with the nice greeting that we just saw before, as well as then some button, right? So remember, this syntax is the JavaScript syntax that allows us to pass a JavaScript variable into a component. So inside of this div, they're saying, hey, we're going to render this custom component, but also I'm going to render this JavaScript variable, which just so happens to be set up here to be another component, right? So the value there is that you can make one variable called button there and set it equal to something specific based on the condition, right? So that's another way that you'll see people doing conditional rendering, setting a particular variable equal to some JSX and then using that in that conditional way, because now just this piece of code will not have to change whether you're logged in or logged out. right? You can see that the button itself wouldn't need to change, because at the end of the day, it's getting set to be either the login or the log out, and that's based on the state. And if the state changes, right? So say something changes this logged in state, well, this entire component is going to re-render, right? Meaning that it's going to say, okay, if for instance, like whenever someone clicks log out, right, it triggers a function that basically sets the state to say, hey, I'm not logged in anymore. Well, that's going to remake this component go back, do the whole render process over. And the component itself is going to say, hey, am I logged in? And clearly at that point, it's going to say, no, I'm not logged in. So instead of showing the log out button, it's going to show the login button, right? So the conditionals kind of allow for you to nest this logic on top of your components. That's really important for when you're trying to create pathways for your user that are going to impact the UI, right? So logging into the application is a conditional operation, because if you're logged in, you should see certain things. Otherwise, you're not going to see anything, right? If a user's paid is like another kind of thing. Sometimes you see like, if, like on like any of these news agencies websites these days, you see that big paywall thing come up that's always like, hey, you're not paid, like you can only see this many articles a month or whatever, right? Experiences like that where you're checking to see if something shows something, right? If this is your first time on the site, I might want to show you a welcome message or a tutorial, versus if this isn't your first time on the site, I might want to show you the actual React application that I built without this tutorial, right? So there's all types of places where you might be thinking about conditionals logic that can be really applied to your build, and to like the components that you're rendering. So I'm gonna pause real quick. Any questions just on this piece or any of the stuff we're talking about? Okay, if it's making sense, just give me a thumbs up so I know that we on the same page here, familia. Yeah, word. Dope, appreciate y'all. Yeah, it shouldn't be too OD of a concept, but like the idea is that you use conditionals to make you can render something based on the conditional. And when you start rendering based on conditionals, well, guess what comes back? Guess what topic comes back? Well, state, state comes back, and props come back, right? Because what things are going to make things conditional most times are going to be, oh, I have a specific data point from prop, and from a prop that I want to check that I have. If the prop is something, maybe I want to do something else. I'm going to do something else. If the state is something, I want to show something. Otherwise, I'm going to show something else, right? And this is kind of similar to that conditional styling that we did when we were working on the color container, right? If you remember when we built that color container a couple sessions back, where based on what button you clicked, the color container itself changed color, right? Technically, we weren't rendering in a conditional, but we used the logic from state and props to make that component itself style in a conditional way. So there's a little bit of conditional styling, which also is a form of conditional rendering, right? It wasn't as explicit as if the color says red, then do this, but we could have very easily made the application that function in a very similar way. We achieved the same thing with just some CSS, which is great. But yeah, as you can see, conditionals come up often. Like it's just part of the programming universe is to be doing conditional logic, Boolean logic, and state and props in React are natural variables that are very widely used when you start actually like pushing data from one place to the next in your components, where you might need to do some conditional rendering based on what you want the application to show at a given moment in time. another good example of where this might come up and that y'all might know or y'all might have seen, a lot of apps these days are doing light mode and dark mode kind of app options for users, where it's like, oh, you know, like see the app in dark mode, see the app in light mode. That would be a great application for like a conditional rendering, right? Like imagine you build an application that is, you build an application that is showing like some styling in one case, but then when a user clicks on a button or flips a switch or whatever, it just re-renders that application with a completely different set of components or styles, right? That would be a great use case for something in a conditional rendering sense. But I'm assuming that just from these first core examples that are on the docs that you can really get the idea of why it's important. So sometimes what you'll see in people's code as they're doing React is like conditional rendering in like an inline kind of conditional render, which happens with the use of the double ampersand operator, which is the logical and operator, which allows you to basically conditionally include whatever JSX element you want to render in the case that some other condition is true. So this is a really interesting syntax that you'll see in certain pieces of certain people's code where they're saying, hey, you know, like say for instance, we have this mailbox component and this mailbox component is receiving some props from its parent. The prop unread messages is going to be an array that essentially lets us know how many messages do we have that are unread? Do we have any? And this component is responsible for showing you how many unread messages you have, right? So if you have unread messages, right, you're going to want to see, hey, you have some unread messages, but you don't want to necessarily see that, oh, you know, if there's no unread messages, it should, you know, it might as well not even show up, right? So here's a way we could do that. Well, conditionally, if we conditionally rendered this, well, you know, there's the case that unread messages, right, which is an array, might have a length that's greater than 0. And if the length is greater than 0, clearly that means that there's unread messages that we need to take into account, right? And if that is the case, right, if it is the case that we have more than 0 unread messages, well, we might want to show how many unread messages do we actually have, right? But if not, say in the case of there not being any unread messages, we don't want to see any component. We don't want to see anything. Well, this syntax actually allows you to structure that kind of a situation out for yourself. So on the left-hand side, so it all starts out with the curly brace, right? And curly braces are very special in React and JavaScript. They signify in the React sense that we're going to pass a JavaScript expression. And that means that we're going to pass either a JavaScript variable, we're going to pass a JavaScript object, we're going to pass a JavaScript function, we're going to pass a JavaScript something. And so here we're clearly passing a Boolean kind of conditional operation here, which essentially says, if this is greater than 0, if that is true, right? If this is true, then we're also going to make this, we're also going to conditionally include this piece of JSX, right? And if this is not greater than 0, right, this is false. So because this is false, this first statement, nothing else would show up, right? Because clearly with Boolean logic, this is false, then it doesn't matter what else comes next. But if this is true, then this is going to be true, and it's going to show this this extra H2. So you see this often in apps that are doing conditional logic. I think it's been like a more popular shorthand more recently than anything. People using the double ampersand operator to conditionally render elements in a really inline kind of style without having to do like the big formal like if else thing. And then I think that, so yeah, here it talks about what I was just saying, you know, it works because, you know, in JavaScript, true and expression will always evaluate to the expression, letting you actually show whatever, you know, have that expression run. Otherwise, if something's false, you will never see that next expression. So yes. So then the last big piece of like something that you'll see often when it comes to JavaScript and like conditional logic and stuff is the use of a ternary operator, which is an inline operator for doing if else Boolean type of logic. So just kind of show a thumbs, you know what I'm saying? How many of y'all have seen like a ternary operator like this before? The little question mark thing. Okay, a couple of y'all. Dope. So the ternary operator is a very interesting piece of code that is pretty much I was gonna say it's definitely something that you can use in other programming languages. You'd have to check if the programming language that you're using allows you to use them, but a lot of different languages definitely allow you to use them. They're essentially an inline if else. So basically the structure of a ternary operator or ternary expression is the condition. So whatever the conditional is, so the if blah, 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 whatever the blah, blah, blah is, right? Whatever that condition is, a question mark, and then what should happen if that condition is true, colon, what should happen if that condition is false. So this is a very general operator, but it allows you to do a lot in one line. So a condition really is any Boolean expression. So in this case, they put a ternary operator in line to kind of make that conditional logic in line. So here they're checking to see are you logged in, right? So remember, if you're looking at a Boolean value and it just is the name of the value, you're essentially asking if this is true or if this exists, if this is true or if this exists. So if this is true, right? If is logged in is true, essentially is logged in is a Boolean. So this is saying, you know, whatever the is logged in expression evaluates to, right? So the ternary expression says, okay, is logged in. That's the condition I'm checking. If this is true, right, I'm going to do whatever comes right immediately after the question mark. So if is logged in is evaluates to true, well, then this expression will say the user is, and it's going to evaluate to returning. It's basically going to return this first item, which is the string for currently. Else, right? So else, if is logged in is not true, right? The else is everything that comes after the colon. So it's going to return this, which is the string for not. So the ternary operator is dope because you can in one line do an if else. So it's like, based on this, if it's true, do this, else do this, right? And so the ternary operator by default returns whatever is after the question mark or whatever is after the colon, depending on how the expression evaluates, how the condition evaluates. What comes after the question or whatever the ternary operator returns is up to you. In this case, they returned a string. You could have returned a variable, or you could return an array, object. You could return a function that called something else. So it's very useful to use a ternary operator to kind of condense that if else logic down from the number of lines that it takes to write if this, else this, to just one line. You know, here's the thing I'm evaluating, if it's true, else if it's not true. And sometimes, you know, you'll see people return a function here versus just a single item. But it all is relative on the situation that you have going on. Quick show of thumbs. Does that make sense? Like kind of how the ternary expression works and why it's valuable? Cool. Awesome. All right. And so here's an example of what I was saying. Like here you can use the ternary expression and the conditional logic. So remember, anytime you're doing like a JavaScript expression inside of a component, you have to wrap it in curly braces to say that you're going to put some JavaScript in there, right? So here inside of those curly braces, they use the ternary expression to, in a shorter amount of code, do the if else logic. So they're checking if you're logged in, if the state is logged in, right? If you are, right, they're going to return the logout button, or they're going to return the login button. So this is the example that we saw before of the logout, login, except now it's just using a ternary expression instead of doing the if else logic as it was. You can always write an if else, right? You can always start off with an if else statement. And then a good way to refactor that if else statement might be to write it as a ternary operator. So you can save a few lines of code. But yeah, so here's an example of them returning an entire like custom component. It's similar if you wanted to return a function, right? You could just run a function, like have some functions defined and run those functions based on the value of that conditional expression. And yeah, so they're talking here about sometimes there are cases where you might want a component to hide itself, even though it was rendered by another component. You can return null inside of the render output in order to say, hey, you know, this component's not going to render anything, it's going to return null. That's not really like, I wouldn't say, I haven't personally done this as often, but it's good to know that if you don't want the component to return something on one case, right, you can return null, otherwise return something else, right? I think part of the reason it doesn't really kind of get done like this is because there's ways that you can just make the conditional rendering say, hey, if this is doing something else, show this, and like make your condition more specific versus having to return null for some reason. But yeah, y'all, this is what conditional rendering is all about. It's a very important and simple kind of concept, right? If you know Booleans and you've used like that kind of logic before, it probably is like makes a lot of sense. But seeing it in the structure of like React is really important, I think, because it gives you some perspective on how does this relate to like everything we've been talking about with state, props, components, et cetera, et cetera. And so definitely wanted to kind of put this in your ear and like make sure that you all understood this. So yeah, any questions or thoughts on the conditional rendering piece? If not, throw a thumb up so we know we good and we gonna keep it rocking.